There's a certain stillness that precedes tragedy, a deceptive calm, like the hushed moment before a storm breaks. That's how August 5th, 2012 began in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. A quiet Sunday morning in America's heartland. The sun rose over the suburbs, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and modest homes. Families gathered for breakfast, children played in backyards. And at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, a striking white building with golden domes that had become a spiritual anchor for the local Sikh community, worshippers arrived early to prepare for Sunday service. They came carrying baskets of food for langar, the communal meal that would follow prayers. Women in vibrant salwar kameez moved efficiently through the kitchen, chopping vegetables and kneading dough for roti. Men in turbans arranged chairs in the prayer hall, while children darted between adults, their laughter echoing through the corridors. This was their sanctuary, their place of peace. None of them could have known that in less than an hour, this sacred space would become the site of one of America's most horrific hate crimes. None of them could have predicted that their lives would intersect with a man whose hatred had festered for years, finally erupting in an act of violence that would send shockwaves across the nation. And none of them could have imagined that their salvation would come in the form of a 51-year-old police lieutenant named Brian Murphy, a man who would stand between them and death, willing to sacrifice everything to protect people he had never met. This is the story of courage in the face, of hatred, of duty that transcends fear, of a community forever changed, and a nation forced to confront its darkest demons. This is the story of Oak Creek. Lieutenant Brian Murphy's day began like countless others before it. The pre-dawn alarm, the steaming cup of coffee, the quiet moments, reviewing reports before his shift. 21 years on the force had established a comfortable rhythm to his working life. At 51, Murphy was exactly where he wanted to be. A respected officer with the Oak Creek Police Department, a seasoned SWAT team leader, and a mentor to younger officers who looked up to his calm demeanor and tactical experience. You never know which day is going to be the one, Murphy often told rookie officers during training. So treat every day like it could be. It was a philosophy that had served him well through 2 decades of policing. Murphy had seen his share of danger, armed standoffs, domestic violence calls that escalated without warning, high-speed pursuits that pushed his tactical skills to their limits. But Oak Creek, a suburb of Milwaukee with around 35,000 residents, wasn't typically a hotbed of violent crime. It was the kind of place where people moved to raise families away from the bigger city's problems. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and community events drew crowds. Murphy had spent the morning handling routine matters, reviewing patrol schedules, checking in with officers on duty, processing paperwork that never seemed to diminish, no matter how efficiently he worked through it. His lunch sat half-eaten on his desk when the first call came in shortly after 10:25 a.m. Possible shots fired at the Sikh Temple on South Howell Avenue. The temple was less than 6 minutes from the station. Murphy was already moving, grabbing his tactical vest and radioing that he would respond. In the parking lot, he slid behind the wheel of his squad car, lights flashing as he pulled onto the road. In those few minutes, as Murphy navigated the Sunday morning traffic, as his mind cycled through protocols and scenarios, normal life continued unabated across Oak Creek. Families headed to churches. Couples browsed the aisles of grocery stores. Children splashed in backyard pools, enjoying the warm August day. But inside the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, normalcy had already shattered like glass. Wade Michael Page, a 40-year-old Army veteran with ties to white supremacist groups, had arrived at the temple parking lot just minutes earlier. His toxic journey to this moment had been years in the making. Dishonorable discharge from the military, descent into alcoholism, immersion in a neo-Nazi subculture that nurtured his growing hatred. Page had prepared methodically for this attack, arming himself with a 9mm Springfield XD semi-automatic pistol, legally purchased at a gun shop in West Allis, Wisconsin, and enough ammunition to inflict maximum casualties. His first victims never saw him coming. Paramjit Kaur, 41, had just arrived for Sunday service when Paige approached her in the parking lot. The mother of 2 adult sons died instantly from a gunshot to the back. Outside the temple entrance, Paige encountered 2 brothers, Sita Singh, 41, and Ranjit Singh, 49, who had stepped outside between prayers. Both men fell as Paige fired repeatedly, their white ceremonial clothes staining crimson in the morning sun. By the time Paige entered the temple's main hall, panic had already taken hold. Worshippers scattered, some fleeing toward exits, others aiding wherever they could. Temple President Satwant Singh Kaleka, 65, confronted the gunman in an attempt to slow his advance, armed with nothing but a small knife used in religious ceremonies. The elderly man managed to wound Paige, leaving scratches on his arm before being shot multiple times. He would later die of his wounds, but his actions bought precious time for others to seek shelter. In the chaos, some worshippers managed to call 911. Others huddled in bathrooms, storage closets, and the temple kitchen, using cabinets and counters as makeshift barricades. Children were pushed into pantries and told to remain absolutely silent. Mothers covered their children's mouths to stifle sobs as footsteps and gunshots echoed through the building. This was the scene Lieutenant Brian Murphy was racing toward, though he knew only the barest details transmitted over the radio. Shots fired. Multiple casualties reported. Active shooter situation in progress. What Murphy couldn't have known was that his arrival would mark the beginning of his own personal battle, a test of courage and resilience beyond anything his 2 decades of police work had prepared him for. Sound, squad car slowing, gravel crunching under tires. As Murphy pulled into the temple parking lot at 10:32 a.m., the scene before him confirmed his worst fears. 2 bodies lay motionless near the entrance. Blood pooled on the concrete. The temple doors stood open, and from inside came sounds of chaos, screams, running footsteps, furniture being overturned. Murphy radioed dispatch. Officers needed at the Sikh Temple. Multiple victims down. Active shooter inside the building. Then he did what 21 years of police training had prepared him to do. He moved toward the danger. Lieutenant Murphy approached the temple with his weapon drawn, moving cautiously but purposefully across the parking lot. Training had ingrained in him the primary objective in any active shooter situation: locate and neutralize the threat before more lives are lost. Every second matters, every decision is critical. He had nearly reached the temple steps when movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from the main doors. Male, white, muscular build, head shaved close to the scalp. In his hand gleamed the unmistakable outline of a semi-automatic pistol. Wade Michael Page had emerged from the temple after shooting everyone he could find inside. Some would later speculate that he heard approaching sirens and decided to confront the police directly rather than be captured. Others believed he intended to escape and continue his rampage elsewhere. Whatever his plan, it changed the moment he spotted Lieutenant Murphy in the parking lot. "Police! Drop your weapon!" Murphy's command rang out across the parking lot, clear and authoritative. Page's response was immediate and violent. He raised his pistol and fired. The first bullet caught Murphy in the throat, tearing through soft tissue just below his chin. The impact sent him staggering backward, but years of training kept him on his feet. Murphy managed to duck behind a parked car, pressing his hand against the wound as blood seeped between his fingers and down the front of his uniform. Page advanced methodically, circling around the vehicle, firing continuously. Murphy tried to return fire, but the wound to his throat made it difficult to breathe, let alone aim effectively. Bullets ricocheted off the pavement, punctured the car's body, and, increasingly, found their human target. A second shot struck Murphy's thumb, mangling it beyond recognition. A third tore through his arm. A fourth hit his leg. Still, the lieutenant remained conscious, remained focused, remained determined to keep the shooter's attention fixed on him rather than allowing him to return to the temple where dozens of worshippers remained hidden. Each time I moved, he had a bead on me, Murphy would later recall during one of many interviews from his hospital bed. I couldn't get a clean shot, but I knew that as long as he was shooting at me, he wasn't shooting at anyone else. Inside the temple, the sudden absence of gunfire created a tentative, terrified hope among those hiding. Gurmail Singh, 72, crouched in a storage closet alongside 4 other elderly congregants, praying silently as tears streamed down his weathered face. In the kitchen, a group of women and children huddled behind industrial refrigerators, the children's faces buried in their mothers' clothing to muffle their frightened whimpers. Amarjit Kaur, 48, peered through a narrow window and witnessed the shootout unfolding in the parking lot. She watched in horror as the police officer fell repeatedly under the gunman's relentless fire, yet somehow continued to move, continued to fight back. He kept getting up, she would later tell investigators through a translator. Even when he was bleeding so much, he kept getting up. I thought, this man is not human. He must be sent by God. But Lieutenant Brian Murphy was very much human. A fact that became increasingly apparent as bullet after bullet tore into his body. 5, 6, 7 shots. The pain was overwhelming, a burning agony that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. Each breath brought the metallic taste of blood. Each movement sent fresh waves of torment through his riddled frame. Still, he remained aware, remained present, remained determined to fulfill his duty. 9, 10, 11 bullets. Murphy's tactical vest had stopped 3 rounds, but the rest found vulnerable flesh. His hands, deliberately targeted by Page to prevent return fire, were shattered. His arms bore multiple wounds. His legs, his shoulder, his face, all bore testimony to Page's methodical cruelty. The 12th shot struck Murphy in the back of the skull as he attempted to crawl to a new position. By all reasonable medical expectations, this should have been fatal. Instead, the bullet traveled along the curvature of his skull beneath the skin, circling his head before stopping near his ear without penetrating his brain. That one felt like someone hit me with a sledgehammer, Murphy would later describe. I remember thinking, well, that's probably it. But then I realized I was still conscious, still thinking, still able to move. 13, 14, 15. Bullets in total. By the final shot, Murphy lay motionless on the pavement, unable to return fire, unable even to seek cover. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the asphalt. His breath came in ragged gasps through his damaged throat, yet his mind remained clear, and his hand still clutched his service weapon, unwilling to surrender even when his body could no longer obey his commands. Page approached to deliver a final execution-style shot, but the sound of another squad car arriving diverted his attention. Officer Sam Lender, a 27-year veteran and the department's firearms instructor, pulled into the lot with his squad rifle ready. Seeing the gunman turn toward his colleague, Lender took aim from behind his car door and fired a single shot from approximately 60 yards away. The bullet struck Page in the abdomen, causing him to stagger. Rather than surrender or continue the fight, Page turned his weapon on himself, firing a fatal shot into his own head. He collapsed near the spot where his rampage had begun just minutes earlier. The entire confrontation, from Murphy's arrival to Page's suicide, lasted less than 5 minutes. In that brief span, 15 bullets had torn through Lieutenant Murphy's body. 6 innocent worshippers lay dead inside and outside the temple. 3 more were critically wounded, and dozens more were alive because one police officer had placed himself between danger and those he had sworn to protect. As additional officers and emergency medical personnel flooded the scene, they found Murphy conscious but grievously wounded. When the first officers reached him, they began immediate first aid, applying pressure to the most severe wounds and calling urgently for paramedics. Despite his injuries, despite the agony that radiated through every inch of his body, Murphy's first words weren't about his own condition. Instead, he rasped through his damaged throat, "Go inside, take care of them first." Officer John Finko, who had served alongside Murphy for nearly 15 years, later recounted this moment with tears. In his eyes, that's who Brian is, bleeding out on the pavement with 15 bullet holes in him, and he's still thinking about the people inside the temple, still putting them first. As paramedics finally reached him, Murphy drifted in and out of consciousness. The last thing he remembers before the darkness claimed him was the sound of a medical helicopter landing nearby and a paramedic saying, "Stay with us, Lieutenant. Just stay with us. The human body is not designed to absorb 15 bullets and survive." By all medical logic, Lieutenant Brian Murphy should have died in that parking lot, his blood seeping into Wisconsin soil as his life ebbed away. That he did not, that he survived to reach the emergency room at Froedtert Hospital in Milwaukee, was described by his trauma surgeons as nothing short of miraculous. Murphy's journey through darkness began in the trauma bay, where a team of surgeons worked frantically to stabilize him. His injuries were catastrophic: a bullet wound to the throat that had narrowly missed his carotid artery, multiple shots to both arms and hands, shattering bones and severing tendons, several wounds to his legs, including one that had nicked his femoral artery, the gunshot to his skull that had traced a path around his head without penetrating his brain. In 20 years of trauma surgery, I've never seen anyone survive this level of ballistic trauma, Dr. Rachel Stevens, the lead trauma surgeon, would later tell reporters. The fact that he remained conscious through most of it is beyond comprehension. The first surgery lasted 12 hours, a marathon operation during which Murphy received over 20 units of blood as surgeons fought to repair damaged arteries, reconstruct shattered bones, and close the multiple entry and exit wounds that peppered his body. Twice during the procedure, his heart stopped beating altogether. Twice, the medical team managed to revive him. When Murphy finally emerged from anesthesia, nearly 16 hours after the shooting, he found himself in the intensive care unit, surrounded by beeping machines and hovering medical staff. His body was wrapped in bandages, with tubes and wires connecting him to various life support systems. The pain, despite powerful medications, was overwhelming, a constant searing presence that made even the slightest movement unbearable. But more difficult than the physical pain was the emotional weight that settled over him as consciousness returned. As the mental fog cleared, memories of the shooting came rushing back in vivid, horrifying detail. The initial call, the bodies in the parking lot, the emergence of the gunman, the first bullet striking his throat, the relentless barrage that followed. And with these memories came the questions that would haunt his recovery. Could he have done more? Should he have approached differently? Were there signs he missed that might have allowed him to neutralize the threat before additional lives were lost? Survivor's guilt doesn't begin to describe it, Murphy would later explain during a physical therapy session, his damaged hands struggling to grip the exercise equipment. "I lived. 6 innocent people didn't. No matter how many times people call me a hero, that fact doesn't change." The darkness that enveloped Murphy during those early days of recovery was not merely physical, it was existential, a crisis of faith, of purpose, of identity. For a man who had defined himself by his ability to protect others, being confined to a hospital bed, dependent on others for the most basic functions, was its own form of torture. "There were moments I wished he'd finished the job," Murphy confessed to his wife, Anne, during one particularly difficult night. "I don't know how to be this person, this broken version of myself." Anne Murphy had been shopping when she received the call that her husband had been shot. By the time she reached the hospital, Brian was already in surgery, his condition listed as critical. For hours, she sat in the waiting room, surrounded by fellow officers who had rushed to support one of their own. Now, at his bedside, she took his least damaged hand in hers and spoke with the gentle firmness that had sustained their 25-year marriage. "You're still you. Different, changed, but still you, and we'll figure out this new normal together." The road to physical recovery proved brutally difficult. Murphy underwent 8 additional surgeries over the next 3 weeks. Physical therapy began almost immediately, agonizing. Sessions designed to preserve function in his damaged limbs. Speech therapy helped him regain his voice after the trauma to his throat. Occupational therapy taught him to navigate daily tasks with hands that would never again function normally. Each small victory, wiggling his fingers for the first time, standing unassisted, speaking a full sentence without pain, was celebrated by his medical team and the stream of fellow officers who maintained a constant presence outside his hospital room. But for Murphy, these victories felt hollow when measured against the losses suffered by the Sikh community. 2 weeks into his hospital stay, Murphy received visitors who would profoundly impact his emotional recovery, the families of those killed at the temple. They came bearing traditional Indian sweets, handmade cards from Sikh children, and most significantly, their forgiveness and gratitude. Amarjit Kaur, who had witnessed Murphy stand against the shooter from the temple window, pressed her, hands together in greeting, and said through tears, "You saved our children. You saved our future. Our community will never forget." Harpreet Singh Saini, who lost his mother Paramjit in the shooting, brought a framed photograph of his family. "My mother taught us that sacrifice for others is the highest form of love," he said, placing the photo on Murphy's bedside table. "You showed that same love to strangers. That makes you family to us now." These encounters marked a turning point in Murphy's recovery. The darkness that had enveloped him began to recede, not because the pain or the guilt had diminished, but because he began to understand his role in a larger story, one that extended beyond the trauma of August 5th to encompass the resilience and compassion of the community he had sworn to protect. "I always thought courage meant not being afraid," Murphy told Anne after the visitors had left. "Now I think maybe it just means doing what's right even when you're terrified. Those families have more courage than I ever will." 4 months after the shooting, Lieutenant Brian Murphy attended his first public event, a ceremony at the White House where President Barack Obama awarded him the Public Safety Officer Medal of Valor. Still using a cane, his hands covered in compression gloves to manage scarring, Murphy stood tall as the citation was read, for extraordinary courage and heroism in the face of grave danger. Lieutenant Murphy's actions on August 5, 2012, exemplify the highest traditions of law enforcement and reflect great credit upon himself, the Oak Creek Police Department, and all American police officers. The ceremony represented a milestone in Murphy's recovery, but the journey was far from complete. Physical wounds had begun to heal, though some, like the damage to his hands and the bullet fragments still lodged near his spine, would leave permanent limitations. The psychological wounds proved more persistent, manifesting in nightmares, flashbacks, and moments of crushing anxiety that could strike without warning. "PTSD doesn't announce itself," Murphy explained during one of many presentations he would eventually give to police departments across the country. "It ambushes you. You're grocery shopping, and suddenly you're back in that parking lot. You're playing with your grandkids and a car backfires and you're diving for cover." Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, Murphy found a new purpose emerging from the ashes of trauma. His experience had given him a platform, and he chose to use it not for personal recognition, but to advance 3 causes that had become deeply important to him: police training for active shooter response, community building between law enforcement and minority groups, and mental health support for first responders. Murphy's first major speech after the shooting came at the invitation of the Sikh Coalition, a civil rights organization that had been formed after the 9/11 attacks to combat discrimination against Sikhs in America. Standing before an audience of nearly 300 people, many of them members of the Oak Creek Temple, Murphy spoke not as a hero, but as a fellow human changed by shared tragedy. "I didn't know much about the Sikh faith before August 5th, he admitted, his voice still raspy from the throat wound. "I couldn't have told you the significance of the turban or the 5 articles of faith, but I've learned that at the heart of Sikhism is the concept of seva, selfless service to others. That's not so different from the oath I took as a police officer." The speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it opened doors to ongoing dialogue. Murphy became a regular visitor at the rebuilt temple, joining in community meals and special events. He developed particular bonds with the children, who had been present during the shooting, many of whom still struggled with fear and nightmares similar to his own. "Lieutenant Brian comes to teach us kabaddi," explained 10-year-old Gurmeet Singh, referring to a traditional Punjabi sport that Murphy had learned to play despite his physical limitations. "He says playing helps keep the bad memories away, and when I see his scars, I remember that brave people can still get hurt, but they keep going anyway." This connection with the Sikh community led to a broader initiative. Working with the Department of Justice's Community Relations Service, Murphy helped develop a training program for law enforcement agencies nationwide, focusing on cultural awareness and community policing strategies for working with Sikh, Muslim, and other minority religious communities. "Understanding builds trust," Murphy emphasized during these training sessions, "and trust saves lives. If those temple members hadn't trusted police enough to call 911 immediately, the death toll would have been much higher." Concurrently, Murphy's experience as an active shooter responder made him a sought-after consultant for police tactical training. He spoke candidly about what worked that day in Oak Creek and what didn't. "I was the first officer on scene, and department policy was to wait for backup before entering an active shooter situation," he explained to a class of tactical instructors in Baltimore. "But we had already lost precious minutes, and I knew people were dying inside. Sometimes policy has to yield to immediate reality." This pragmatic approach resonated with officers dealing with an increasing frequency of mass shooting events across America. Murphy's emphasis on rapid response, coupled with his living testimony to the risks such response entailed, helped reshape protocols in departments from coast to coast. Perhaps most personally meaningful to Murphy was his advocacy for mental health, support among first responders. Having experienced the depths of PTSD, survivor's guilt, and depression during his recovery, he spoke openly about his own therapy journey, breaking through the stubborn culture of silence that often prevented officers from seeking help. "The old mentality was, suck it up and drive on," Murphy told a group of police chiefs at a national conference. "That approach is killing us. We lose more officers to suicide each year than to line-of-duty deaths. If I can help change that by admitting I needed help, then taking 15 bullets was worth it." 2 years after the shooting, on a warm August evening, Murphy sat on the patio of his Oak Creek home, sharing a beer with Officer Sam Lender, the colleague whose accurate shot had ended Wade Michael Page's rampage. The two men had formed a deep bond through their shared experience, though they rarely discussed the details of that day directly. "You know what still gets me?" Murphy said, breaking a comfortable silence. "I keep thinking about what you said when they interviewed you afterward, about taking that shot from 60 yards away." Lender nodded, his weathered face solemn in the fading light. "That I was just doing what I was trained to do." "Exactly," Murphy replied. "We were both just doing what we were trained to do. But here's the thing I've realized. Training can prepare your hands and your head, but not your heart. That part comes from somewhere else." Lender considered this, then raised his bottle in a toast. To doing the job. Murphy clinked his bottle against his friend's. To doing the job. In that simple exchange lay the essence of who Lieutenant Brian Murphy was before August 5th, 2012, and who he had become since, a professional who had prepared diligently for a moment he hoped would never come, a man who had faced unimaginable violence and emerged not unbroken, but unwilling to be defined solely by his wounds. A survivor whose greatest legacy might not be the lives he saved that day, but the changes he helped implement to save lives in the future. 5 years after the Oak Creek shooting, the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin hosted a special commemoration service. The temple itself had been transformed, physically renovated to remove the bullet holes and blood stains, spiritually renewed through the resilience of its congregation. 6 memorial stones stood in the garden, bearing the names of those lost: Paramjit Kaur, Sita Singh, Ranjit Singh, Prakash Singh, Suveg Singh Katra, and Satwant Singh Kaleka. Among the hundreds who gathered for the service was Lieutenant Brian Murphy, now retired from the police force, but still very much active in the community. His physical recovery had plateaued years earlier, leaving him with permanent disabilities, limited function in his hands, chronic pain from bullet fragments too dangerous to remove, visible scars on his face and neck. But as he often told the police cadets he now instructed part-time at the academy, scars are just reminders that you're stronger than whatever tried to hurt you. The ceremony included traditional Sikh prayers, speeches from community leaders, and the unveiling of a new peace garden designed to promote healing and reflection. When Murphy was invited to speak, he approached the podium slowly, still walking with a slight limp, another permanent reminder of that August morning. 5 years ago, I arrived at this temple as a stranger, he began, his voice strong despite the scarring in his throat. I knew nothing about your faith, your traditions, your community. I was simply a police officer responding to a call. Today, I stand before you as family. You have taught me the meaning of Chardi Kala, the Sikh principle of eternal optimism and joy, even in the face of adversity. You have shown me that hatred can inflict terrible wounds, but it cannot break the human spirit when that spirit is bound together in community. The man who came here 5 years ago wanted to divide us. He wanted to sow fear and hatred. He wanted to prove that our differences define us. But look around this room today. Look at the faces of different colors, the heads covered in turbans, and scarves and hats and nothing at all. Look at how we have come together, not despite our differences, but because we recognize that those differences are so much less important than what we share. August 5th, 2012 will always be a day of tragedy. We will always mourn those we lost, but it has also become a day that reminds us of our capacity for resilience, for compassion, for unity in the face of forces that would tear us apart. I'm often called a hero for what I did that day, but the real heroes are in this room, the survivors who have rebuilt their lives, the families who have continued despite unimaginable loss, the children who still come to this temple without fear. You are the heroes of this story, and if there is one lesson I hope we all carry forward, it is this. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Love is not the absence of hatred, but the refusal to let hatred have the final word. And community is not the absence of differences, but the celebration of the beautiful tapestry they create when woven together. As Murphy concluded his speech, a group of Sikh children approached the podium, bearing a gift, a ceremonial kirpan, the symbolic sword carried by initiated Sikhs to represent their commitment to protecting the vulnerable and standing against injustice. Though not himself a Sikh, Murphy had been made an honorary member of the community, and this gift symbolized their recognition of his embodiment of their core values. Later, as the formal ceremony gave way to the traditional langar, the community meal where all sit together regardless of background or status, Murphy found himself sitting beside Amarjit Kaur, the woman who had witnessed his confrontation with the shooter from the temple window years earlier. "Lieutenant," she said softly, using the title he had technically relinquished upon retirement, but which the community still used out of respect, "do you still have the nightmares?" Murphy nodded, honest as always about the ongoing cost of that day. "Less often now, but yes, they still come." She nodded in understanding. "For me also. But I have found something that helps. Would you like to know what it is?" "Please," Murphy replied. "Each morning when I wake, I go to my window and look at the sunrise. And I say to myself, today is a gift that 6 of our brothers and sisters did not receive. So I must live it fully. Enough for all of us." Murphy considered her words, then smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his scarred face. "That's beautiful and very wise." "It is not originally my wisdom," she admitted. "It came from something you said in one of your first interviews after you recovered. You said that surviving gave you a responsibility to make your life matter." Murphy had no memory of saying this, but it resonated with the philosophy that had guided his recovery and his work since the shooting. "I'll try your sunrise practice," he promised. "It sounds like good medicine." As the evening drew to a close, Murphy made his way through the temple one last time, pausing to speak with survivors, to ruffle the hair of children who had been infants when the shooting occurred, to exchange embraces with the relatives of those lost. In each interaction, there was a quality of genuine connection that transcended the circumstances of their first meeting. Outside in the parking lot, the very spot where he had confronted Wade Michael Page, Murphy paused, looking back at the temple illuminated against the darkening sky. The golden domes gleamed in the last light of day, and the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open doors. A reporter who had covered the 5-year commemoration approached, notepad in hand. "Lieutenant Murphy," she called, "one last question, if you don't mind. Looking back with everything you've been through, the injuries, the pain, the PTSD, would you do it again? Would you make the same choice to confront the shooter alone?" Murphy didn't hesitate. "I'm glad it was me," he said simply. "I wouldn't want that on any of my guys. That was mine to carry." He turned and walked to his car, moving carefully but purposefully. A man who had stared into the darkest possibilities of human hatred and emerged with an unshakable belief in the counterbalancing power of courage, duty, and community. Behind him, the temple stood strong, not just a building repaired after violence, but a living symbol of resilience. And within its walls, the community gathered in the ancient practice of their faith, their prayers rising like incense into the Wisconsin night, carrying with them the names of those lost and the hope for a world where such sacrifice would no longer be necessary. For Lieutenant Brian Murphy, for the Oak Creek Sikh community, and for a nation still wrestling with the complex interplay of hatred and heroism, the journey continued. Changed by trauma, strengthened by recovery, united by shared humanity, this was not merely the end of a tragic story, but the ongoing affirmation that even in our darkest moments, light finds its way through. This is the legacy of Oak Creek. This is the testimony of Lieutenant Brian Murphy. This is the power of ordinary courage on an extraordinary day. The end.